And we're joined now by Mohamad Elmasry, Professor of Media Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Mr. Elmasry, always good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. Let's start by talking about what we're hearing from our White House correspondent in Washington, D.C., from our correspondent on the Italian island of Capri, which is that the U.S. and EU want to sanction Iran over its attacks on Israel over the weekend. The same leaders wouldn't, at the UN Security Council, condemn Israel's bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus. They're all telling Israel not to escalate the situation. But what are their actions telling Israel? Right.
I mean, it's been fascinating to watch. As you mentioned, these countries are refusing to condemn the attack on the Iranian consulate. Not only that, but they're not even acknowledging that there was an attack on a consulate. Yesterday, there was a press briefing where Matthew Miller, a spokesperson, says, you know, we're not even sure if it is a consulate. And he was pressed by an American journalist.
Yeah.
And the American journalist says, well, how long does it take for you to figure out if this is a consulate? And of course, this is just smoke screen. Everybody knows it was a consulate building. So it's been fascinating to watch that. They're not putting the appropriate pressure on the entity that needs pressure applied to it. They're turning a blind eye to Israeli aggression, and they're throwing all of the blame on Iran, which was just retaliating, right? And they're, of course, not framing it up that way. So I think that they're going to continue to along the same course. This is kind of what this kind of U.S. foreign policy does.
Yeah.
And I think we can expect more of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and on a course where, again, you know, as we were hearing from our White House correspondent, passing more sanctions on Iran when Iran is already one of the most sanctioned countries in history.
Right.
And while there's so much focus now on the Iran-Israel tensions and what's Israel going to do and how is Iran going to respond, what does that mean for Gaza and what Israel can do in Gaza while the world's attention is now distracted?
Right. Well, first of all, I think there's kind of a diminishing returns with respect to the sanctions. I don't think that the U.S. is going to get what it wants to out of additional sanctions because there's only so much more that they can do, and Iran has actually proved relatively resilient in the face of the ongoing sanctions, and they've moved over toward Russia and China, so they've been able to pivot. So I don't think that that's going to really have much of an effect on Iran. With respect to Israel, certainly part of this was, part of the attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria was meant to be a distraction. Israel is losing the war. There was an editorial published in Haaretz the day before yesterday, and it said something like a total defeat for Israel. And they talked about the 4 elements of defeat. Hamas still exists. They haven't destroyed Hamas. They haven't gotten the hostages back. Israel is less safe, and Israel has a worse standing in the global community than it did when it launched this war. So Haaretz, an Israeli media outlet, is calling this a total defeat. The Israeli government can see that, and that's one of the reasons why they attacked the consulate, to shift the narrative back to a kind of pro-Israel position, an Israel sympathy in the global community. And then, as you mentioned, they can then use all of this as a smokescreen to continue their bombardment of Gaza, which we've seen over the last few days, a number of massacres being carried out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, today, 7 people who were trying to connect to the internet in a tent killed. Yesterday, children playing, in a playground in a refugee camp. We heard some very interesting, if not depressing, frankly, comments from the Qatari foreign and prime minister talking about the very difficult role of a mediator. We know Qatar has been key in the ceasefire negotiations, just saying that they can't make the parties do anything they don't want to do. How does that bode for an end to the conflict?
Well, we've been talking, it must be very frustrating, first of all, for Qatar, especially because they're being accused by Israel of not being a fair, neutral arbiter, which is absurd. They've been praised far and wide, even by the United States, right, for remaining neutral and really trying to broker a ceasefire. The reality is that the United States has to put pressure on Israel to create the conditions for a ceasefire, not Qatar putting pressure on Hamas.
Which is exactly what the Turkish foreign minister said, that the U.S. needs to say enough to Israel.
Hamas is already on board with a ceasefire agreement. They've put forth recommendations, proposals that are consistent with what the international community wants and with what Daniel Levy is calling a reasonable position. He's the former Israeli negotiator. So Hamas's position is consistent with what the world wants, and it's the U.S. and Israel that are obstructing a peace agreement. So it must be very frustrating for the mediators, especially for for Qatar, and especially given that they're then accused by Israel. The reality is this: we're not going to get a ceasefire until the United States applies its leverage, because Israel does not want to stop this war. I've been saying for 6 months that Israel's main goal in all of this is to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. They wanted to use October 7th as an opportunity to get rid of the Gazans, and then they can take over the Gaza Strip. That's their goal. That's the so-called Greater Israel Plan.
All right, Mr. Mohamad Elmasry, thank you as always for your analysis. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.